imagine just for a second the concept of home.
Right.
And I don't mean the house you grew up in or, the city where you pay your taxes.
Of course.
I mean the idea of a place that really anchors you, a place that defines who you are simply by the nature of its soil, the color of its sky, and its basic struggle to exist.
It's the ultimate form of environmental determinism. The geography doesn't just shape the economy of a people, it shapes the very soul of the species.
Right, and we've spent a lot of time recently on the deep dive talking about some incredibly abstract, mind-bending concepts.
Cosmic chaos, the noctia.
Exactly. Forces of order, things that exist completely outside of time. But today we are landing the ship.
It is a significant shift and honestly a necessary one. We're moving from the metaphysical right down to the physical.
Yeah.
Today we are opening up PDF 004, which is simply titled Antares. If the previous sources were about the ghosts of the galaxy, this document is about the builders.
We're talking about the Antarans. And the source makes this distinction right out of the gate, which I found really grounding. It says that unlike the Noctea or the Guardians of Doctrine, the Antarans were a real civilization. They weren't just abstract whispers in the dark. They built physical things. They had to make decisions.
And most importantly, they had to fight to stay alive.
Right.
Not against a monster or some alien invasion, but against their own environment.
Yeah, the mission for this deep dive is to really understand that environment. We want to understand the pressure cooker that created the most important archivists in the Orion saga.
We are looking at a profound transition, a shift from an Earth-like paradise to a dying, arid world. And we want to see how that trauma shaped an entire culture of keeping and tending.
It's a bit of a mood shift for us. I feel like we should almost lower the lights a little in the studio.
Yeah.
This isn't a horror movie like the Noctia files were. This feels much more like walking through a very quiet, very ancient museum.
That is the perfect analogy. It is observant. It's serene. But there is a distinct sadness to it, or perhaps melancholy is the better word.
Melancholy, yeah.
So let's unpack the identity of these people before we look at the planet itself. The source document makes a fascinating distinction between the old Antaran and the Antaran of legend.
Yeah, this caught my eye immediately. I think when we hear highly advanced aliens in sci-fi, or even earlier in this saga, we have a certain stereotype in our heads.
Cold, logical beings.
Right, Spock-like, completely detached. But the source describes the old Antarans as raw and almost human.
Yes.
It says they were highly capable of love, of fear, of dreaming.
Precisely. And it is crucial not to romanticize them as simply emotional. The text emphasizes that they didn't start out as these stoic keepers of galactic knowledge.
They started as people very much like us.
Exactly. The document literally says the world was kind. It didn't bite, at least not at first. The Antarans we see later in the records, the ones who build the Etherians, who catalog the galaxy, they are the product of what happened to their world. They are the result of a massive transformation.
And that transformation isn't biological evolution in the traditional sense, is it? It's psychological adaptation to a dying rock.
It is entirely adaptive.
So let's talk about that rock. Let's talk about the Antares system. Because frankly, the astronomy described here is, well, it's pretty bleak.
Bleak is a human judgment, but visually, yes, it is quite dark. The source tells us that the Antares system is located in the Orion arm, which is standard enough. But the star system itself is ruled by twin brown dwarfs.
Okay, I'm going to pause on brown dwarfs.
Yeah.
Because I think people hear dwarf star and they immediately think of a red dwarf, like Proxima Centauri.
Small, red, but still a burning star.
Right. But a brown dwarf is something else entirely.
Very different. In astrophysics, a brown dwarf is essentially a failed star.
A failed star.
Yes, they are substellar objects. They have mass, certainly more than a planet like Jupiter, but not enough mass to ignite the hydrogen fission that powers a main sequence star like our sun.
Wow.
They don't burn bright, they just glow.
So they're closer to a really, really hot Jupiter than they are to our sun.
That's a very fair comparison. They emit mostly in the infrared spectrum. They are dim, they are cool. The source explicitly describes them as dim little suns that barely cough out enough light or heat to keep anything alive for long.
Barely cough out. That is such a vivid image. It paints this picture of a sky that isn't blue, isn't bright, it's permanently twilight.
Permanent twilight, yes.
Maybe a dull reddish magenta haze.
Likely a very deep bruised purple or magenta, and that leads to the crucial realization, really the aha moment for the entire Antaran civilization. If your suns aren't providing the energy you need to survive, where do you look? You can't look up. Photosynthesis, as we know it, would be incredibly difficult, or at least very alien in that specific light spectrum.
So if the sky is empty of energy, you have to look down.
You look down. The source states it plainly. Life here doesn't come from the sky. It comes from below.
That brings us to the planet itself. The source paints this beautifully tragic picture of Antares in its prime.
It does.
It says it used to be almost exactly like Earth. Mild weather, big seas, vast green plains. It sounds like an absolute paradise.
It was a paradise, and that is key to understanding the Antaran psyche. They remember that paradise.
Ah.
They didn't evolve from scratch on a harsh, unforgiving rock. They lost a paradise. The document calls this process the slow death.
The slow death. I think that's actually the scariest part of this whole file. When we talk about apocalypses, we usually talk about the bang.
The cataclysm?
Right, an asteroid hits, the nukes fly, a plague wipes everyone out in a week. But this was just time.
Exactly. It's an entropy death. No big bang, no dramatic explosion. The oceans just shrank inch by inch, year by year.
Just evaporating.
Yes. The forest died off slowly. The fertile dirt turned to sand over millennia. The planet didn't explode, it simply faded. Imagine the psychological impact of that over deep time.
It's intergenerational trauma on a planetary scale.
It really is. Generation after generation, the green gets a little further away, the fresh water gets a little scarcer.
Yeah.
You grow up hearing these mythical stories from your grandparents about a great sea that is now just a cracked salt flat. It creates a culture of immense pervasive loss.
It reminds me of the visual the source gives of the current state of Antares. It describes endless dunes broken only by a handful of green pockets. It's an oasis world now.
Yes, an oasis world. And those oases aren't there by luck or random chance. This brings us to the mechanism that allows life to persist there at all.
Right, because we established the suns aren't doing the heavy lifting.
Exactly. The savior of Antares is what they call the flame.
The flame. Now, when I first read that, I'll admit, my brain went straight to fantasy. I thought, okay, is this some mystical fire? Is it magic?
A very natural assumption.
But the source is pretty clear that it's geological, right?
It is geological. But to the Antarana, the distinction between geology and theology is basically non-existent.
That makes sense.
The text describes it physically as the planetary core. But the Antarana perceive it as a massive pump for life energy. It compensates for those weak brown dwarfs.
So it's keeping them warm from the inside out.
Yes. Without the flame, the planet is just dead rock in the dark. It is a massive, strong geological force that literally keeps the biosphere breathing. Think of it like a global geothermal radiator that pulses.
But the way they talk about it in the document, it's not just a radiator to them. The source says it's not magic, it's system.
Right.
But then it goes on to say the planet thinks, adjusts, holds on.
Yeah.
That's a very blurry line between geology and biology.
It is, and that is exactly where their entire cultural philosophy begins to emerge. This is essentially the Gaia hypothesis on steroids.
The Gaia hypothesis.
On Earth, that hypothesis suggests that living organisms interact with their inorganic surroundings to form a synergistic, self-regulating system. But on Antares, the source suggests this is intensely literal.
Wow.
The planet actively regulates its core temperature to sustain those specific oases. It is a deliberate feedback loop.
So if you live on a world where the planet itself seems to be fighting to keep you alive, actively adjusting, holding on bail, you stop viewing nature as something to be conquered.
You view it as something to be tended.
Tending. I love that word in this context. It seems to be the central pillar of their entire existence. It informs their whole social structure, doesn't it?
It dictates their social structure completely. The document details a system that we might clumsily call a caste system.
But caste usually implies oppression or inequality.
Exactly. Whereas here it implies necessary function. The population is strictly divided by their relationship to the preservation of the world.
Right, so let's look at those. There are the tenders of the flame, who I assume are the engineers or geologists keeping that core stability monitored.
Correct. They are the ones listening to the planet's heartbeat deep underground.
Yeah?
Then you have the keepers of the green. Those are the ones responsible for the agriculture within the fragile oases.
Makes sense.
In a world where every single drop of moisture is worth its weight in gold, farming isn't just a job. It is a sacred, vital duty.
And finally, there's the group that eventually becomes their defining legacy in the galaxy. The archivists.
The archivists. These are the individuals who record everything.
Literally everything.
Everything. Because when your world is constantly fading, forgetting is the ultimate sin. If a specific species of desert plant goes extinct, the archivist ensures its genetic code, its image, its exact ecological function are preserved forever.
Wow.
This social structure isn't about wealth or power hoarding. It's purely about the logical distribution of survival tasks.
It really struck me while reading, usually civilizations in history, including human history, are defined by conquest.
Always pushing outward.
Right. We conquer the river by building a dam. We conquer the forest by clearing a field. But the Antarans, it implies almost a subservient role to the planet.
Precisely. The source says for the Antarana, that made it real something to care for, not conquer. This is that environmental determinism we touched on earlier.
It dictated their values.
Entirely. When the world shifted from lush to barren, they couldn't force the planet back into what it used to be. They had to bend with it.
So this slow death effectively created the famous Antaran personality.
It shaped it from the ground up. The source actually lists 3 key traits that emerge directly from this scarcity: memory, planning, and patience.
Let's break those down a bit. Memory makes perfect sense in a scarcity context. If you lose things constantly, if the forest you played in as a kid is just gone by the time you're an adult, you become obsessed with remembering it.
Correct. And if you recall from our very brief look at PDF 001, the introduction to the saga, it mentions that the Antarans saw knowledge not as a possession, but as a duty.
A duty, right.
We can trace that duty directly back here to the drying soil of Antares. They learn the hard way that things disappear. The source quotes a fundamental belief: nothing lasts. Don't waste it.
Don't waste it. That applies to water, obviously. But they applied it to information too.
Yes. Think about it practically. If survival is that precarious, you simply cannot afford to make the same mistake twice.
No margin for error.
None. You cannot afford to forget where the subterranean water was last year. You cannot afford to lose the oral history of how your ancestors survived the last great drought. So they became archivists by necessity.
It's fascinating how their legendary status, the high-tech, wise aliens we see later in the records, is actually born purely from desperation.
Yes.
They aren't wise because they're superior beings floating on clouds. They're wise because they had to be incredibly smart just to not die.
That is the poignant beauty of their history. The source explicitly mentions that this specific, agonizing struggle for survival is what makes Antares the true origin point of the saga's preservation efforts.
It said survival wasn't about power, it was about knowing and caring.
And bending.
Yes, bending. That was the other word that really stood out to me. Bending rather than breaking. And this philosophy seems to influence their daily life and even their architecture, doesn't it?
It deeply influences their architecture. The document describes their cities not as towering, arrogant skyscrapers defying the elements.
No glass towers here.
No. They are low, organic structures that physically hug the landscape. They build directly into the canyon walls. They dig deep into the planet's crust to be closer to the flame's radiant warmth.
The text mentioned curved lines and sand-colored stone. Almost like they're trying to camouflage their cities with the desert rather than stand out against it.
It is an architecture of profound humility. If you build a rigid tower on a dying, windswept world, the sandstorms will simply scour it down to nothing.
But if you build a bunker that flows with the dunes...
Exactly. It survives. The wind passes over it, and this concept of flowing with the environment mirrors their physical appearance as well.
Right. Let's talk about what they actually look like, because with that dim brown dwarf lighting, I imagine they don't look much like us.
They are humanoid, but distinctly and beautifully adapted to their reality. The source describes them as tall and incredibly slender.
Which is pretty common in low gravity or heat dispersing environments, right?
Yes, in this specific case, it is likely about heat regulation and extreme resource efficiency. A slender, delicate frame requires much less caloric intake to maintain.
That makes sense.
But the most striking feature of the file notes is their eyes. It describes them as large, dark, and highly reflective.
Like a nocturnal animal on Earth.
Exactly like that. In a world of perpetual bruised twilight, you need to capture absolutely every single photon of available light just to see.
And their skin?
They have pale, almost grayish skin. There is no harsh UV radiation from a yellow sun, so there's no evolutionary need for protective pigmentation like melanin. They are quite literally ghosts of the twilight.
It creates such a haunting, serene image, these tall, pale, large-eyed figures moving completely silently through these low, curving stone hallways, quietly recording history while the desert wind howls outside.
And their mode of communication reflects that exact silence.
Oh, right.
The source notes that while they do have a spoken language, it is incredibly soft, it's tonal, and often very sparse. Much of their daily communication is actually nonverbal.
Gestures and things like that.
Micro gestures, slight shifts in posture, eye movements. In a quiet museum, you do not shout. And on a quiet, dying world, you simply do not waste breath.
That ties into their cultural expressions too, right? Everything is focused on harmony.
Yes, their art is minimal. It's focused on capturing the essence of things that are fleeting. A single drop of water, a rare, blooming desert flower.
I want to circle back to their technology for a minute, because despite this almost monastic, quiet vibe we're describing, they are a spacefaring people. They aren't stuck on Antares forever.
No, they are highly advanced, but their technology strictly follows their philosophy. It isn't loud, it isn't aggressively combustion-based.
It's not rocket fuel and fire.
Far from it. It is silent, hyper-efficient, and designed to be eternally long-lasting. Their ships, which the document touches upon briefly, are not warships.
They're exploration vessels.
Entirely. Designed for extremely long-term data gathering across the Orion Arm.
And the most significant piece of technology they ever built. Well, they built the Etherians. We've touched on them in previous deep dives. These are the grand constructs, right? The guardians of the archives.
Correct. The Etherians are massive, non-biological beings built solely for preservation. Now, looking at this specific file on their homeworld, does the creation of the Etherians make more sense?
It makes perfect sense. The Antarans essentially built a permanent technological version of themselves.
Yes. They built them to ensure the act of remembering would continue seamlessly, even if they themselves or their fragile world finally failed.
That connects the dots so beautifully. The Etherians are the ultimate expression of that deep Antaran fear of losing things. It's like they looked at the cosmos and said, we might die, our world might finally dry up completely, but the memory absolutely must continue.
And that profound drive, that stubborn refusal to let the light go out, is what defines them as a people. The source literally calls Antares a testament to resilience. It's a world that simply refused to die.
It really redefines the whole concept of survival for me. Usually when we hear the phrase survival story, we think of someone fighting off a bear or surviving a war or being stranded on a desert island.
A violent struggle.
Exactly. But this is survival as a quiet, deliberate, daily act of tending. It's survival as maintenance.
And maintenance requires a very specific, often overlooked kind of heroism. It's not the loud heroism of the sword, it's the quiet heroism of the gardener during a 10-year drought.
That's a great way to put it.
It's patient, it's methodical, and it's deeply inherently communal. You cannot survive a slow death alone. You need a highly organized society that values the collective good and the collective memory far above any individual gain.
Which brings us right back to that opening idea of home. Antares isn't just a physical rock they happen to live on. It's the teacher. It's the thing that taught them exactly how to be who they are.
The source ends on a beautifully poetic note regarding exactly this. It states, Antares isn't just dirt, it's proof.
Proof of what?
Proof that survival isn't about exerting power over nature. It's about knowing, caring, and bending. Every cycle that comes after this in the saga, every great library that gets built, every single archive protected, it all stems directly from the hard lessons learned on this scarred little oasis world under the dim light of brown dwarfs.
It's a gorgeous, if somewhat melancholy image to leave on. A serene civilization meticulously building a legacy of cosmic knowledge, while the sands literally slowly close in around them.
And it creates a profound sense of gratitude within their texts. They don't hate their dying, difficult world. They love it fiercely because it is the only reason they are still there to observe the universe.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into PDF 004, let's quickly recap the journey. We started with the Antarans, not as abstract, distant gods, but as real, tangible people who loved and feared.
We examine the Antares system, ruled by those dim twin brown dwarfs, where life has to draw its energy from the planetary core, the flame, rather than from the sky.
We saw the brutal but slow transition from an Earth-like paradise to an arid world of dunes, the slow death. And we saw how that immense environmental pressure forged a unique culture of equilibrium, patience, and absolute memory.
A resilient culture built entirely around the belief that nothing lasts, so you must never waste it.
It's a powerful lesson. And honestly, it raises a really uncomfortable question for you, the listener, and for us sitting here, really.
It does.
The source mentions that the old Antarans were almost human in their emotional makeup before the world changed them. They had to culturally learn that extreme patience and foresight to survive their slow death.
It sets up a rather provocative thought experiment for anyone looking at our own planet. If our world underwent a true slow death, if the oceans shrank and the green faded steadily over centuries, would we be able to develop that same patience?
That's the real question, isn't it? Would we become tenders and quiet archivists, carefully preserving every single drop of water and every scrap of recorded knowledge?
Or would we lose what makes us human in a violent scramble for whatever resources are left?
Would we band together to gently tend the flame? Or would we just let it go out while fighting over the ashes?
Something to carefully consider as you look up at the sky tonight.
Definitely. Hopefully your sun is a little brighter than a brown dwarf.
Let us appreciate the bright light while we have it.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Antares. We'll catch you in the next one.